origins of the modern English theater go back to the Middle Ages. Of course, we have all of these precedents in ancient Greece and Rome, but the early church took a pretty negative view towards the theater for various legitimate reasons, and as the West Christianized, theater sort of died out to a large extent, especially insofar as it was often connected with pagan rites and such. Like many things that needed to be purified and die and rise again in Western culture, theater sort of rose again beginning in the Middle Ages with liturgical origins, eventually coming out of the liturgy and becoming what we know as the medieval mystery plays or the medieval miracle plays. These eventually led to a tradition of theater in England and elsewhere, leading to, what we know of as, the Elizabethan theater and the roots of the modern English language theater tradition. So today I'll be talking about medieval mystery plays, which was a new topic for me to explore. And my guest, I have to thank him for inspiring me to read some of these. He suggested that we do this podcast. Gregory Roper is an associate professor of English and the dean of students at the University of Dallas. He's published on the influence of medieval penitential manuals on Middle English lyrics, on the Gawain poet, and on Chaucer. His book, The Writer's Workshop, kicked off an interest in teaching writing through imitating the classics. And his next book on writing, Mastering the Four Arguments, will also be published soon by ISI Books. Greg, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I've really loved the times I've been able to check out the podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I especially love your love of Thelonious Monk, which is I didn't realize that we shared. I've been a jazz fan. I was a sax player back in high school in those days, and I came to Monk. Now I have to say, I think there's something you've missed in Monk in the previous discussions I've heard, and that's that he's so funny. That he has such a comic way. I mean, and it's an intellectual comedy, right? We think of tragedy as the emotional art, and comedy actually as the intellectual art, right? It takes wit and understanding to get a joke, and I find that Monk is full of jokes. And the more, I don't know much music theory, I think you know a lot more than I do, but I find that his plays on chord structures and the note that he'll reach for at various times, I'll just burst out laughing sometimes. Yeah. And it's such a great part of my delight in him.
That's true. Yeah, many people have noted that sort of element of humor in his work, and I think, of course, you're referring to the interview I did with Ed Fezer, and we started out talking about jazz and Thelonious Monk and stuff, and that was so great because he's people love his writing and his apologetics and his philosophy, and then to be able to use someone with his credibility to maybe get more more people who are interested in those sorts of things, also interested in jazz, was fun.
By the way, I think it actually fits with today's topic because there's the same sense of humor and a comic vision in the midst of other very strange topics that one wouldn't ordinarily think they would fit with today. So,
yeah, well, let's talk about these plays. I mentioned that they come out of the liturgy. I did a little bit of reading about that. So these biblical pageants that we'll be talking about, and we're particularly going to be talking about the English tradition of these, but they existed in late medieval France, Spain, and Italy as well. From my understanding, they derived from earlier Latin liturgical plays, which themselves grew out of these 10th century tropes. And that term will be familiar to people who know about the history of sacred music. But tropes were these kind of chanted dialogues used at times like Easter and Christmas. And they were sort of like they began as these localized kind of elaborations that were inserted into the standard liturgical chants, both elaborating the text and elaborating the music. And they eventually got bigger and bigger until they became like independent songs or motets. But there were these introit tropes, in particular at Christmas and Easter, which became dialogues. And the most famous of these apparently is that the Quem Quaeritis, whom do you seek, in the Easter introit, which reproduces the dialogue between the Marys and the angel at the empty tomb of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess that these eventually developed outside of the liturgy into mystery plays or liturgical plays. But it was interesting reading about the tropes, just Googling a little bit, because apparently, they also developed into various forms of entirely secular song. I read some Catholic Encyclopedia article. Maybe it was the article on tropes. I can't remember what article it was, but they had a interesting quote from one Reverend Walter Howard Frere. He says, "For the musician, the whole story is full of interest. For the tropers," meaning that the books in which the tropes were written down, "practically represent the sum total of musical advance between the 9th and the 12th century. All new developments in musical composition, failing to gain admission into the privileged circle of the recognized Gregorian service books, were thrown together so as to form an independent musical collection supplementary to the official books." And that's quite interesting. Now, there's all sorts of, mentioning the development of secular song. Of course, secular song exists in the Middle Ages, but is much less documented. So we know it exists, but we have much less of it than the liturgical stuff that was written down and preserved by the church. And what I also read is similarly in secular drama, there was secular drama such as Robin Hood plays and things like that, but little of that survives as well. And as long as I'm talking about different parallel art forms sort of growing out of the liturgy, I might as well mention the carol tradition as well. I did a whole long episode on the history of carols in England, which were not just a Christmas phenomena. They were, covering the whole cycle of the year. And there were secular carols as well, just, carols about springtime and things like that. So, it's quite interesting. And when you learn about the carols and then you learn about the miracle plays or the mystery plays, then you get you start to get a picture of the fabric of life as a whole and the fabric of the arts as they developed, increasingly independent of a sacred context, although often still religious in nature. So it's quite fascinating to study these things and see the connections between them.
Yeah, I want to so much already, and everything you've talked about. I want to caution about two kind of narratives that you'll sometimes still encounter in some of the criticism. One is, I think, a more popular that no scholars really, abide by today. But, the first is that the church hated drama. The church did its best to kill drama, to shut down drama. These are half truths, right? In that the church did shut down late antique Roman drama, partly because it had gotten, quite frankly, pornographic. It was really awful by the end of, the decadent days of the Roman Empire, and it needed to be shut down.
Well, my theory about the reason that Providence allowed the survival of some of Aristophanes' plays is that we could see that the church fathers were not just being, puritanical grumps.
Yeah, and drama did exist even in those early days, in the sense of saints' lives were acted out. We actually have some texts of those from very early times. So there was that, and so this did happen. I mean, you're right to see, and I want to come back to the 9th century becomes this new kickoff that starts with the tropes. But I think the other narrative that we have to be careful about. Frankly, this was in my Norton Anthology of Literature when I learned these things and read this section, was this idea that actually starts more with the Shakespeareans working backwards, sort of trying to sort of work out where did Shakespeare come from. And it's this kind of, it's this narrative that says all of this started in the church, and gradually, then it went to the church porch, and then it went out into the cityscape. And so it's this narrative of increasing secularization, which, kind of fits, an Enlightenment modernist, kind of notion of everything is progressing towards a more secular state, right? And in fact, what we know is that, as you said, there's drama out, just as there is song, just as there are carols, there's drama out in the secular space. And they actually, happened in parallel with one another and actually interpenetrated one another, which I think we'll get to when we get to the cycle drama.
Right.
There were mummers' plays, and there were feasts and jugglers and verbal jousts and maid Morris dancing and things like that. That was purely secular. That happened alongside. So we don't have to buy into this modernist notion that Shakespeare comes from this wonderfully secularizing thing of getting away from Christianity, getting away from the church. Again, by the end, I want to sort of show that Shakespeare was deeply affected by this very Eucharistic Catholic cycle drama as much as any secular drama as well. So I think those are important. Yeah, the wonderful thing is to then begin. We do have now. You're right. You're right also that a lot of the secular stuff gets lost, right? Like a lot of early blues music we will never get back to in the Delta of Mississippi until people started, recording that and scholarly activity started taking interest in folk music, right? But it starts with these tropes. And I think for a lot of your listeners, maybe the best way to understand what the tropes were, the kind of surviving thing is we have these sequences, right? And you go during Holy Week and right, large feasts and after the epistle, right? We have, and everybody sort of says, oh, why do we have these sequence things? Well, that's the holdover from these longer sequences and tropes that we would have quite often in the church.
Right. And they were at a certain point, they were eliminated, perhaps because they were becoming too locally variable, or I don't know the details of the history, but maybe they were just getting out of hand a little bit.
And then there was the sense of actually beginning to act them out.
Right.
To dramatize them in those moments. And as you say, one of the first was the quem caritis, right? Whom do you seek, right? And that begins acted out. And then there were Christmas, right? To the shepherds, whom do you seek in Praesepe? On Ascension, right? Who do you seek up above in the stars? Mm-hmm. And so these begin to be acted out. And in class one day, we have our Cistercians across the street, and I had Stephen Gregg, this tremendous Cistercian, in my class, and I said, "Can you bring over a thurible today? Can you just bring a thurible to class?" And he's like, "Why?" And we brought, and we realized, right, in the gifts of the Magi, there would be this procession, and the church was, had a kind of sacred space that was being used, right? And the procession would be, and they'd be sensing with the thurible, acting out the Magi coming to the manger. And I paused, and I had the students act this out of class, and I paused for a minute, and I said, "Hold on a minute, what's that?" And they said, "Well, that's a thurible." And I said, "No, it's not. It's gold, frankincense, and myrrh." And well, no, it's a thurible. And I said, that's exactly it, right? At that little moment, we're making that transition from a liturgical procession into drama. So you can see this thurible as both. It is at once, right? You look at it from one angle, it's a thurible, and we're having a procession and we're sensing. You look at it from another angle, and now it's become a dramatic object. It's become a prop. And that's that beautiful moment, I think, that we have as drama is being, as you say, sort of born again in Western culture, as these tropes are elaborated and people begin to see, like, this is kind of neat. We can actually dramatize, right? What is actually, the Mass is itself a drama, and we're making the Mass that more present by these acting out things. That, of course, is the beginning. And there are many of these different ways that liturgical drama begins to get elaborated in fascinating ways. But the explosion we want to talk about really comes in the late 14th and into the 15th century.
Right. And just to continue looking at sort of the big picture of the history of these things, as this becomes more and more too elaborated so much that it can no longer really take a proper place in a liturgy. Right. This becomes more of a properly theatrical phenomenon. And eventually Pope Innocent III bans the clergy from acting on a public stage. And so at this point, then you have the guilds taking over these dramas, and we'll talk more about what they did and their role in a bit. But the plays themselves, I'm relying to a large extent on this book that you recommended. I'll give this as a reference to the listener too. So this is Everyman and Medieval Miracle Plays, edited by A.C. Cawley. And I also like the fact that it is published by the publisher Everyman, so that's kind of nice. Yes, so it's got a selection of medieval miracle plays, but also the famous morality play Everyman at the very end of the collection. And so I'm relying to an extent on Cawley's historical introduction and these things. But he says that they were probably written by clerics, which is true of the early carols as well, some of the earliest manuscript carols from the late Middle Ages. And another thing I saw in common with the carols is the frequent use of apocryphal sources for some of the elements of the plays, meaning, different apocryphal gospels that sort of made their way back into medieval preaching as a way of sort of elaborating on the canonical gospels.
Exactly.
And a good example of that in the realm of carols is the Cherry Tree Carol. I forget which apocryphal work that's from, but basically this idea of Saint Joseph being very suspicious of Mary's, unexpected pregnancy, and the way in which this miracle at the cherry tree kind of shows to him that this is not, an ordinary conception. But they have things from apocryphal sources in these miracle plays as well. And also, like the carols, these are suppressed later on in English history after the Reformation. The carols are suppressed by the Puritans, and perhaps the mystery plays are suppressed even a little earlier, because I read that they're suppressed by the Reformers under Elizabeth. So that'd be
right.
So that's very interesting. And just because you already mentioned Shakespeare, if I can just say, I've often thought, had the specific thought of Shakespeare, I wish Shakespeare had written a tragedy of King Saul, because I think that would have been so awesome. That would have been just such a great subject for him. But in fact, his plays are not religious plays. They're not biblical plays. I should say specifically, they're not biblical plays. Yeah.
But there are real connections in the sense that, well, I'll get to some of those as we go on. But there are real connections, and there's real possibilities that Shakespeare at least knew of these cycle plays. Well, he clearly does know of them, but may have even seen some of them.
Well, I was trying to. So yeah, I was just sort of setting things up here, but now let me throw it to you even more and just. Yeah, please talk about these pageants, these cycles, what they were, and the context in which we have these plays in a collection such as this.
Yeah, that'd be great. So as you say, like there were these different sorts of liturgical plays that were then beginning to break out into more dramatic space, more elaborate tales of Bible stories. The real kickoff, Cawley's wonderful. There's been a lot of huge work since that book, largely by, frankly, the Marxist new historians, who've done an amazing amount of work on how these plays took place, the social context in which they took place. And a great kickoff, you might say, is 1264, when Urban IV institutes the Feast of Corpus Christi, right? Largely under Aquinas' influence and the miracle of Bolsena, right? And then there becomes this real dedication to the Feast of Corpus Christi, right? And we work towards a date for the Feast of Corpus Christi, which has stayed pretty much the same ever since, right? It's after Trinity Sunday. So, right after we have Pentecost, then we have Trinity Sunday, and then we have the Feast of Corpus Christi, which again moved around a little bit in the Middle Ages, but largely then. And I want you to think about when that is in a northern latitude like England. This is an agrarian society. The crops are in the ground. Days are long, right? They're really long. I was in Ireland once in the summer, and I love showing a photograph to people, and I say, "What time do you think this is?" And they guess about 7:15 in the evening. It's 10:30 at night.
Yes, I had the same experience. I was in the UK last summer, and in Scotland, sunset was after 10 p.m.
Yeah. And so there's this wonderful time where the community can come together. There's not a lot of daily work to do in the agriculture community, and we can come together. And so what we think is sort of between both these kind of, you might say, secular human needs and the church plopping a feast day right in front of them, this develops these huge festivals, and these huge festivals of plays that happen in this time, and they seem to locate around this feast of Corpus Christi. And what's fascinating is how much we know about how they actually took place, right? The late Middle Ages were really the birth of a sort of bureaucratic record keeping. And they're often called the mystery plays, not because they stage mysterious things happening, but because they were put on by the guilds, as you mentioned, right? And the guilds, when you were instituted into a guild, right, it was said that you were learning the mysteries of blacksmithing, woodworking, cobblering or whatever. And so the guilds themselves became known as the mysteries. And so these plays are often called the mystery plays for that very reason. And here's the fascinating thing. Like, we have actual records over decades of a particular guild putting on one of these plays over and over again. We know what they spent on costumes. We know what they spent on props and materials, like over a certain amount of time. We have records of the city fining a particular guild, saying, well, you didn't do this very well last year. We're taking that play away from you, which caused a lot of, and this is the amazing thing that these new historicists have come up with. And so we know that this is a huge civic festival mapped over a religious festival. And this is where I'm saying, in some ways, that secular and the religious come back together in these festivals. We know the path. So these were all performed on carts. That we can see two different ways they were performed. One is that the carts wove their way through town. We know the actual path they took through the town of York in that cycle of plays. And they would stop at various times and perform these plays. Or we have some evidence that the carts would be positioned, say, all around the town square, and the people would move to the various carts while they were all performing them. But either way, there's these little playlets called pageants that are put on, and they cover all of sacred time, all of sacred history. They start with the creation, and there's a little playlet on the creation. There's a little playlet on the creation of Adam and Eve. There's a little playlet on the fall. There's a little playlet on Cain and Abel. And they go all the way through biblical history, all the way, right, to the end of time, to the second coming, right? And so this is a way, of course, of teaching the people the stories of the Bible. I love these sort of ideas that no one in the Middle Ages knew the Bible, or the Bibles were chained up to keep away from people. Well, for one thing, they were chained up because they were enormously expensive things, right? You don't want to put a $4 million object just sitting around in the church for anyone to walk off with it. But people knew an enormous amount of the Bible. There was a scholar who went and studied, but this is how they knew the Bible. They knew it through carols, through plays, through music. And these performances took you from the beginning of sacred time and walked you all the way through the Bible to the book of Revelation. And there were these little playlets. Now, they're put on by the guilds, so they're put on by townspeople, probably written by a cleric in town, right? Because there's an enormous amount of sophisticated theological stuff going on in these plays. But they're performed by your fellow townspeople. And I love that thought of, who plays God? Which guild gets to do the creation? Well, probably like the carpenters, and I can't remember, but we have a record of those guys. Who gets to do Adam and Eve? Noah, right, has a play that became very famous for Noah's wife being this kind of cantankerous, shrewish woman who refused to get on the ark. She's like, oh, it stinks in there. It's smelly. I'm not doing this sort of thing. And often there were kind of fisticuffs between Noah and his wife. She became a famous image that Shakespeare picks up on in The Taming of the Shrew. Wow. She becomes the shrew figure in the Middle Ages.
And this was put on by the shipwrights, perhaps.
These guys all put on these plays, right? And so what you're seeing are your fellow townspeople, right? In these cities that are not very big. York is 10,000 people, I think, at this time. Yeah. And it's the second largest city in England. So you're seeing your friends up there. You're seeing probably the young, beautiful 14-year-old girl playing the Virgin Mary. You're seeing, a friend of yours playing God and playing the devil. And what this is going to lead into is a great deal of playing to the audience, a great deal of physical comedy and physical humor. And so these plays have this fascinating mixture of very serious subject matter, and then also a heck of a lot of fun and goofiness, quite frankly, where
Right,
you're
because
playing to the audience.
they do read like something like a community theater kind of thing, you know.
Absolutely.
And that's not to say that there's nothing sophisticated in them. And I, in particular, the verse, pretty much across the board, I was pretty impressed with the verse. These are verse plays, you know. We should
Hmm.
mention that, I guess. But yeah, there is this kind of yeah, this winking to the audience and things like that happen.
Oh, sure. You know, in the Second Shepherd's play, which, if you're an English major, might be the one you know, because it was the one that got kind of stuck into the Norton anthology for many years. You know, um, there's a lot of funny things we could come back to, but at the end, you throw kind of the villain of the play in a blanket, and you probably got the audience to help out with that, right? And you get down, and there's kind of audience participation in a great number of these plays.
Right.
And you can imagine them kind of booing and hissing, you know, the devil and the evil characters, and cheering on the good characters.
Right. Right.
But I think another thing that's so fascinating about these plays is there's a great deal of anachronism in them. And so, and you read in, say, the Abraham and Isaac play, well, and Abraham keeps mentioning the Trinity. And it keeps talking about praying to the Trinity, right? And
Right.
you think, like, what's, you know, these are just sort of silly medieval people. They made a mistake. They didn't have a sense of historical time schemes or periods that we gain in the Renaissance. No, I don't think that's what it is. Actually, I think what you'll find in so many of those places is what they're playing with is typology. And the Abraham and Isaac play, right, is teaching, right, these villagers in York or Coventry, the very notion of the typology of Abraham and Isaac as a type of the crucifixion. And the scenes are just incredibly moving and poignant, right? As Isaac appeals to his father and says, there are things like Abraham saying to Isaac, "Isaac, sweet son, peace, peace, for thou breakest my heart on three." You know, with a Trinitarian reference there, right? Isaac says, "Father, since it may be no otherwise, let it pass over as well as I." You know, the image of Isaac as Christ and instituting a new Passover. I mean, that's really subtle stuff that's being taught to illiterate, you know, carpenters and wheelwrights and cobblers in the town of York.
Right.
Really, and powerfully moving moments, right, where Isaac eventually says, "Oh, Father of heaven, to thee I cry, Lord, receive me into thy hand." It's really fascinating and moving stuff where the author of these texts keeps using this notion of anachronism as a way to introduce typology, it seems to me.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about here. Now, my experience reading the plays, and I didn't have the time to reread most of them, so it was just reading my first impressions and, you know, getting used to the language and stuff. I wouldn't say that I was greatly moved on a religious level by many of them. Some of them I was, like the that moment with Isaac that you mentioned, and particularly the way that there's a sort of psychological realism to it, because you have Isaac begging Abraham for his life, and then he submits when he learns that it's God's will that he be sacrificed. But then after everything was resolved and God stops Abraham from sacrificing his son, and they get the ram, and Isaac is still a little bit shaken up, and he's still a bit scared, and he says he never wants to come to that hill again. So there's a bit of realism, because, you know, when I read that story, of course, I always wonder, well, what was it like for Isaac after going through that experience? And there's a little bit of a nod to that, which I liked. The scene of the woman caught in adultery is quite dramatic. The lamentation of the women on their way to the tomb in the resurrection play is quite moving. The crucifixion is quite moving. The way that they... the whole thing is about the workmanship of the soldiers crucifying Jesus, and it's just this long belabored process of nail the hole there, not there, and kind of like the realism of the perspective of these people who are just doing a bit of work in nailing this man to a cross, and the sort of brutality of it is really emphasized.
That one's really fascinating. It was my friend Stefan Novinsky who, gosh, about 8 or 9 years ago, actually put on a good number of these plays here at the university. It was a 3.5 hour production. He says he'll never do it again. But it was really moving. And I will say a lot of these, I think they don't read as well on the page as, say, a Shakespeare play. Sometimes they can come across as a little bit flat, but in performance, Stefan says that this is theology in 4 dimensions. Right, is that we add time and movement to them. That one in particular is so fascinating because, yes, on the page, it's like, oh, we're going to approach the crucifixion from the point of view of these guys building the cross, and they actually, stretch Christ, like, oh, we put the hole in the wrong place, like, so we'll stretch him a little bit here, right? But Stefan taught me that if this is up on like a wheeled platform above the audience, right, who are down on the ground, what's happening here is the cross is flat on the platform. What you're seeing are these guys drinking, cursing, complaining, like, oh, what a day we're having, what everything, right? And then at the end, what happens is you raise Christ up. And it's only at the end of, listen to these ordinary guys complaining about their day and right? And in fact, sort of enacting the kind of selfishness, the ordinary selfishness of day-to-day sin of 14th, 15th century carpenters, right? And that then we raise Christ up and we're like, oh my gosh, like this is what we're talking about, right? This is what Christ's sacrifice is about, is not about, something fancy. It's about ordinary guys complaining and cursing and having to fight through just a tough day. And oh goodness, right? And that's where these plays, I think, really come alive. And that's really, it is, I admit, it's hard to see just on the page. Right. But when you see them performed, is really something. Here's another example of that. The Second Shepherd's play, right? Which uses the same sense of anachronism, right? It starts in this very odd way. There's these shepherds running around, and they're clearly 14th century shepherds. They're complaining about 14th century problems, and you're like, what's that all about, right? Again, did the Middle Ages just not have this sense of time? And then it becomes this odd play about one of the shepherds, Mac, who wants to trick the other guys and steals their sheep. And you're like, where is this one going? Like, what is this about? He takes the sheep home, gives it to his wife, and says, hey, hide it here. And here's these guys coming in. And she's complaining. She's saying, what is wrong with you? Don't you realize this is actually a capital crime? We could all, we could be sentenced and die for this. And he's like, don't worry about it. We're going to get away with this, right? By the way, he weaves a magic circle around them to keep them asleep and prays in Manuus Pontius Pilato, right? He prays in this kind of devilish curse in the name of Pontius Pilate. That's a weird little moment, right? The shepherds come in and they're looking all around the house and they're sort of comically dumb about this, like, I don't seem to see anything, right? And he says, would you guys get out of here? My wife just gave birth and you're bothering us. And they say, oh, I'm sorry about that. And they ran out and they say, well, I didn't see anything. Did you see our sheep? No. And one says, oh my goodness, here she was. She just gave birth and we didn't bring them a gift. We need to go back in. And they go back in, right? Now, again, you have to see this visually, right? And in class, I make the students get up and I get a Mac's wife to lie down on a table and Mac to stand next to her. And I then have three shepherds come in and stand next to them. And then all of a sudden they see it. I was like, oh, that's the manger scene that's set up in my house every Christmas. It's these 3 shepherds and it's a mock manger scene. And guess what's in with the wife? A lamb. Right. And all of a sudden, visually, we're about to see in the next playlet, or the next pageant, is going to be the actual nativity scene where you have a lamb, right? A child who is the lamb. Right. And my guess is it's an agricultural society. They actually put a real lamb in there, right? Which is funny, right? The poor little lamb, he doesn't want to act this day. He's probably making noise. And the shepherds do the Seinfeld thing, right? They go like, that's an ugly baby. right? And Mac has to make, oh, well, he broke his nose coming out of the birth canal. That's why he looks this way. And they, being doofuses, walk away, right? After leaving their gifts. So there's this moment of charity, and it's charity for the lamb that we're about to, right? So we do again this typology thing. Like that's this
Yeah,
marvelous
I didn't pick up on
notion.
that while reading
And
it.
you
That's
have,
great.
but well, you don't reading it. You have to see it visually. But when you see it visually, it pops, and you think, "Oh my goodness!" Right? That's
Yeah,
the literal lamb. In a moment, we're going to see
right,
the figurative lamb. And so then, when you see the nativity play, right, it becomes.
right,
And now the bridge in that is when the angels appear to the shepherds, and the language completely changes. And again, you hear
right,
this, and suddenly the language is completely elevated, and they go off and they give their gifts to the Christ child. They give these very ordinary shepherd gifts. They give a ball and cherries, by the way, that those cherries come back again. They give a group of cherries and a ball. So what the Magi are going to give these spectacular gifts. These are ordinary shepherds. And so this amazing connection is
hmm,
made not so much on the page, but as Stefan says, in 4 dimensions. And you have to see it and you have to see the action. Now I'm going to jump in and do your Shakespeare thing. Shakespeare learns this. It's called the double plot in drama worlds, right? Where you put something on stage, and then the very next scene, you put something else on stage, right? And you stage the same thing, and so that the audience visually makes the connection. And when you see Shakespeare, he's going to do this over and over and over again. The beginning of Merchant of Venice starts
right.
with, oh, I'm so sad about life. Act 1, Scene 2 is Portia with Nerissa, and she says, "Oh, I'm so aweary of this great life." Like Shakespeare loves this thing of the double plot. That's straight out of the psychodrama.
That's
Straight
really
out of the
cool. Yeah,
psychodrama.
yeah. Thanks for
Yeah,
pointing that out.
yeah. He learned all of
Um,
those tricks right there.
I think there's something the way I experience these plays on paper, everything is kind of spelled out in a way that perhaps can reduce the dramatic aspects of it a little bit. Like it's very emotionally direct. Sometimes I would say even emotionally naive. Sometimes just direct in a healthy way. As you know, we obviously have problems with emotional directness in our storytelling today. To talk about the anachronisms a little bit more, I noticed that there's a number of different types of anachronism on display in the plays. The first of those is just like a cultural anachronism. Like you say, they're 14th century shepherds. That doesn't bother me at all. That doesn't reduce there's no dramatic problem there. Or even Herod in the Herod play making reference to mass and matins, and I just understand that as that's their word for whatever Herod's equivalent of those religious services would have been. So it's kind of like a shorthand almost, in my opinion. Then there's kind of didactic anachronisms of the type that you were talking about. So in the shepherd tells the Christ child, "I would drink of thy cup." That's a
Mhm.
kind of a didactic anachronism. Now, the dangers of some of those is that they work in a typological way, but they perhaps reduce the sort of dramatic tension of the story that's being told, in that the newness of the revelations that are being made is perhaps underplayed uh, in contrast to the continuity that's being emphasized of the Old Testament typology. And so sometimes for me, I didn't mind it. Sometimes I felt that it detracted from the tension. A lot of the anachronisms are incidental, and they come in the form of oaths that are taken by the characters. These plays had a surprising amount of what I would describe as bad language, or sort of like, the medieval equivalent of "I swear to God," just in
Yeah.
sort of a very frivolous context, or even things like Christ's curse, or swearing by the cross, or, Noah's wife, we have her swearing by Christ, we have her swearing by St. John, and by St. Thomas of Kent, somebody says. It's I don't always like that. I mean, you can portray an impious character, of course, but there's a lot of that. But sometimes those anachronisms actually result in a little bit of absurdity, and so when you have when the soldier that's nailing Christ to the cross takes an oath by him who redeemed you, where like this is the guy who's nailing Christ to the cross, so it doesn't make any dramatic sense at all for him to say by him who redeemed you. You know what I'm saying? So there's different like gradations of anachronism, and sometimes where it's sort of incidental and it doesn't really matter, and then sometimes where for me it kind of detracting from the dramatic effect of the revelations of the gospel and things like that would have been shocking or surprising to the characters at the time. So I'm curious what you think about that.
I would offer a couple of ideas. One is that I think we're, I'm a scholar of Chaucer, and I think that we're often shocked by how earthy medieval literature, medieval texts, medieval men and women could be, and that they're and even these clerics writing these plays are very clear that there's a kind of earthy reality, that they're not afraid to go there, and have. I agree. It's incredibly shocking to have the guy nailing to the Christ's body to the cross, take an oath upon him. But I think actually we're supposed to see how shocking and troubling and disturbing that is. And I think it's supposed to be a sense of, you're supposed to wake up and say, hey, when you say, I swear to God, like that actually means something. And
right.
You're supposed to see that, at that moment, like, that's just a kind of phrase you throw out in your kind of earthy daily language. What the Italians call parolacce, the bad words. That's not insignificant to speak in that way. Or when Herod, says these really strange oaths himself, that's supposed to be
Mahound, and isn't that Muhammad or something? Remind me what Mahound is?
Oh yeah, like he's this is the sort of Dante use of Muhammad, right, as the great schismatic, right?
Yeah.
By the way, Herod is another one of those great Shakespearean.
Oh, dude, the Herod play is awesome.
Herod became right, and he was known for having this kind of being played in this kind of high pitched, almost whiny, ranting voice. So I don't know if you know your Hamlet well, right? But when Hamlet is instructing the players, he's telling them not to overplay the role. He says it out Herods Herod when you overdo the lines. And he's making specific reference to the fact that everyone knew the Herod plays, and that Herod is this histrionic figure.
It's what we would describe as mustache twirling, right?
Yeah, snidely.
As is the Satan as he appears.
Yeah,
in
absolutely. Yeah.
Plays.
So there is that. I guess I would draw you on to here's my sort of money payoff sort of line for today. Is I would draw you on to what I would consider the most significant notion of this whole concept of anachronism, which is that if these really are plays to celebrate the feast of Corpus Christi, then what we are celebrating, right, is that every time one goes to Mass, right, when the priest elevates that host, it's all of sacred time, right, is present and is collapsing. We're not just memorializing something that happened, say 1400, 1500 years ago in first century Palestine, but we are reenacting a drama, but we're making present all of time together at that time, right? This is something that Flannery O'Connor, I think, right, is trying to get at in her short stories, that the Christian drama is not like reading a history book. The Christian drama is the drama in each soul at each moment. And I think that's what's marvelous about this very deliberate sense of anachronism that is shoved all the way through these plays, and which I think you're right to sort of develop a kind of taxonomy of these different kinds of anachronism. But I think as you finish the sequence, you begin to fold in this idea that I'm not just watching a linear sense of time, that Christian time is linear, but it is also cyclical. It is also that time, this is the four quartets, right? That any moment in time contains all of time. This is this is Julian and Norwich. All of this, that a Christian has this sense, at least dual and maybe triple sense of time. If he takes what he does when he goes to mass with any seriousness whatsoever.
Should we talk a little bit about the special effects or the ways that these would be staged? We already talked about the wagons, but just about the costuming and different things that would have been on display there, how that might have influenced later theater.
Yeah, this is when we should have had Stefan here as well, because he actually had to do this. But it's fascinating to think of, how do you stage God? How do you stage these people coming in? So maybe there were crane apparatuses. There's clearly a door in the bottom that the devil can come up from the bottom of these pageant wagons.
Right. I understand sometimes the wagons would have had multiple levels too.
Like
some of them had
different levels as well, right? Where you would signify different kinds of spaces and things. It seems to be just the creativity of these. I think maybe the best way to think of these wagons is much more like a float. A Rose Bowl parade float, or one of the crews in I actually like that analogy, the crews in Mardi Gras in New Orleans, because those are, again, communal events, right? You have these social groups called the crews that get together every year. It's very competitive, and I think it's worthwhile to imagine the wheelwrights competing every year against the carpenters, against the cobblers. There's a kind of social competition going on to see who can put on the best pageant. And these, we may have stored these and improved upon them each year. But yeah, you're going to have to figure out, like, how does the devil emerge from hell? How does God come from above? And now the city of York has begun putting these plays on again, and you can see some of these in YouTube, and really have a great time with that. And again, it's pretty clear that the Globe is, with its thrust stage, may have, that the Elizabethan theater may have taken some of these ideas, and we know that there was a trapdoor in the Globe's thrust stage. Right. Pretty clearly, they've learned some things and are adapting some of this drama.
Right. What was this thing? The Hellmouth.
Yeah. So there would have been
that exactly?
Probably some sort of some sort of hole in the ground, right? That the devil and different devils could have kind of come up out of, or maybe positioned behind it. The stage, right, that you would come up, but just the creativity that would have been required, I think, and the challenges.
But also the scope of it. I mean, some of these must have taken place across multiple days. I mean, wasn't there one town? Which town was it that they had like 48 different plays?
So one question is, were they all performed every year, or did they do a sort of a selection each year to really do this? To say all 48 plays in I think it's the Chester cycle. There's no way you could do it all in one day. And in York, they're currently doing it. You would start the creation play down the path, stop at station 1 and perform the creation play. They'd go down a little bit further, stop at station 2, and then they would all sort of gather at the end in the cathedral square. But that takes hours and hours, and you would have had to start early in the morning, and it would have been an all-day festival. But it's hard to get them all in. So my guess is there's probably a selection each year, some sort of a selection of the different plays offered, or you did it over a couple of days and did it that way. I wanted to. So I mentioned the Out Herod's Herod. I mentioned the double plot idea. I also want to say that, Shakespeare actually begins his career writing a cycle, right? He writes, but it's the cycle of the English Civil War, the Wars of the Roses. He writes 4 plays, and then he goes back, right, and writes the prequel cycle. Now, what's happened there, right, is you've taken a sacred subject and turns it into a political subject, right? And we know that Elizabeth actually deliberately put secular holidays, right, her coronation day, things like this, to displace saints' days. So there was this considered move, right, at that time to turn sacred time into secular political time.
But is there a reason that he wouldn't even have been able to write biblical plays? Would that have been a political thing, or was that just the conventions of storytelling at the time? And why are there no biblical plays in the Shakespearean?
So there'd been a move in sort of in the waning of the 15th century to do some more political topics. But I think it's the dawning of the Renaissance, right? And it's a turn towards ancient sources. So yeah, right. He turns to Plutarch. He turns to why am I blanking out? The Comedy of Errors, right, is just a doubling of an ancient Roman play. And so I think that's part of it as well. There's a sort of turn towards the ancients as one's, as kind of the elite sources from which to draw. But I think these notions that he had some experience, or at least it was still in cultural memory, might have something to do with, right? And here again, what the new historicists have developed is, what you might call the Catholic Shakespeare. Now, I think Joseph Pearce probably goes a little too far. Joseph Pearce is convinced Shakespeare was Catholic, but we do know that Stratford was a home of recusant Catholicism in Shakespeare's youth. His great master at the Stratford School, who drilled him in his ancient sources, which made him, use, every rhetorical figure that the ancient rhetoricians, ask you to use. We know now that he was, one of the best students of his years at, I think it was Oxford, but it's beginning to look like he probably was a Catholic and couldn't get a job in London. And so he finds himself in this, more remote trading town and becomes this fantastic teacher at the Stratford Grammar School. What a tremendous act of providence for the rest of us. Right. That Shakespeare had a teacher like that. So there is this sense that at least the memory of these plays, could have been still there. That even after Elizabeth suppressed them, now some of the plays do still survive, and they seem to be portrayed, but they're kind of stripped of a lot of the more Catholic references, and they become more biblical plays. So they're still there, but it is interesting that, Shakespeare wanting, performing with his troupe in London, very careful of the Puritan authorities, I think turns to ancient sources, under Elizabeth in particular. I think he's pretty careful not to tread too heavily into a world that had been suppressed.
Right. And now Colley, in his introduction to his collection, also mentions another influence of these plays on Elizabethan drama being what he calls mingling kings and clowns, that this sort of mingling of the popular elements and the sort of the earthy humor and all these things in with these high figures and the comic relief even in the intense drama. And now, was that something that didn't exist as much in ancient drama? I mean, of course, we had ancient comedies that, like, Aristophanes makes fun of, dignified, noble figures in his plays, but that's different from having a drama, serious tragedy in which, these sort of comic peasant elements are intermingled with the noble characters.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you think of, what do we call Aristophanes as old comedy, and then it's shortly after that we move into what the ancient Greek people or scholars call new comedy, right? And I always contrast this, and this will date me in this reference, right? But Aristophanic old comedy is much more like South Park or Monty Python, right? It's political, it's scatological. It's really fierce and
it's kind of anarchic.
And anarchic, right? Whereas the new comedy is more domestic. And I'm saying this is going to date me. It's more like the Cosby Show, or everybody loves Raymond, right? It's more about domestic relations, and we have these type figures of, the young ingenue who wants to marry the student, but she's actually, being betrothed by dad to the miles gloriosus, the braggart soldier. And Shakespeare is playing, with so many of those in some of his comedies. And so there is that side. But I do think he retains some of this medieval, mixing of the high and the low in really fascinating ways. And I think that is a great part of what we think of as the genius of Shakespeare, is that he did retain. So he retained both a kind of you might even see almost a medieval allegorical sense with, right, this new sense of, you might say, the symbolic or the metaphorical. And I think it's what makes him as great as he is that he perches on the cusp of these different worlds in so many ways. We haven't really talked about the other form of drama in the Middle Ages, which is the morality plays, right? Which is, you mentioned Everyman, but Everyman is kind of an odd morality play. It was actually Dutch. But the morality plays were performed in the exact opposite kind of people in an opposite sort of way, right? Morality plays were performed by these kind of semi-professional troops that would have maybe 5, 6, 8 at the very most players, almost like the players in Hamlet. They would roll into town, bang on the drum, blow the trumpet, say, "We're putting on Everyman this evening," right? They put on this play. They probably only have enough props to what they want to wear. They want to keep their costs down. They want to keep their troops small because they're going to perform, pass the hat at the end of the day, and move on. So they're going to perform these very limited, structured, short plays. Now we have not all of sacred time. We have the span of one life. Everyman, mankind, which is my favorite of all of them. By the way, also one of the filthiest ones, but this really powerful play about mankind going on to his destiny, being hoodwinked by, and here's the figure, the other part that Shakespeare takes, he was called the vice figure. And in many of the plays, his character is just named Vice. And his job is to tempt the everyman, the mankind figure, away from the path that grace is already leading him on, right? And pull him out. Now, that's if you're an actor, that's the part you want, right? He's going to have all the funny lines. He's going to have all the naughty lines, and he's going to have all the fun of pulling the main character away from him. Now, eventually he's going to be defeated, but he gets all the fun. Well, guess what? The fat, drunk, liar Falstaff is called by Prince Hal. Prince Hal refers to him as my reverend vice. And so Shakespeare knows the vice figure backwards and forwards. And there are many vice figures. Iago in Othello is like the apotheosis of the vice figure, right? A figure who in some ways is unmotivated by anything except his desire to destroy. His desire to destroy an otherwise good man.
Interesting.
And so there's so much medieval in Shakespeare.
Yeah. Now, this collection, again, has Everyman in it, and that's the only... this was my first time reading that as well, and it's the only morality play that I've read. And I have to admit, I found Everyman far more dramatically compelling than almost any of the miracle plays, and which is very surprising considering that it's completely allegorical. I certainly wouldn't have expected a play that is... all the characters are allegorical, and they have names like knowledge and stuff, to be as surprising and dramatic as it was. There were some real turns that I did not expect. Yeah, and now I want to talk about the verse a little bit, because there's all sorts of interesting, fun verse forms in these plays, some of which are kind of unusual. And I think the thing that I enjoyed most about reading these plays was simply the verse and the language. Often it has sort of a, perhaps unintentionally, comic effect, because some of the language is so strange to us and sort of has this kind of this odd sound to it now, which I think is a legitimate source of enjoyment for a modern reader. But it can be quite effective. It's quite musical and just a lot of very interesting forms. So I wanted to read a couple of little excerpts so people can get a sense of the language and the verse. The first of which would be from the Creation play. And this is, probably would have been a little bit humorous to the audience at the time, but perhaps even more so because of the unusual language to us. This is Lucifer, getting all puffed up right before the fall. And even though some of the words are unfamiliar, you can tell, even if you don't know what the words mean, you can just tell that this guy's, bragging about himself. Oh, what? I am fetus and figured full fit. The form of all fairhead upon me is fest. All wealth in my weald is, I wot by my wit. The beams of my bright head are bigged with the best. My showing is shimmering and shining. So bigly to bliss I am brought. Me needs for to noy me right not. Here never shall... Here, sometimes it's hard to read. Me needs for to noy me right not. Here shall never pain me be pining. So there's a lot of great alliteration too in this particular play, not in all of them, but this one is heavily alliterative, which is also fun. Yeah, no. So there's just some great fun language in there, but it's quite well written. There's another one that I like that also sort of made me laugh, which is this is in the Wakefield Second Shepherd's pageant, which is just kind of funny sounding. That these are the shepherds reacting to the angels singing Gloria in Excelsis, and I'm not going to read the different. It's a couple of different shepherds speaking to each other, but say, what was his song? Heard ye not how he cracked it? 3 brevs to a long, yea, Mary, he hacked it. Was no crotchet wrong, nor no thing that lacked it. For to sing us among right as he knacked it, I can. Let us see how you croon. Can ye bark at the moon? Etc. It's just, it's kind of funny, but hacked it, cracked it. There's just something. So, I'm sure it must have been funny to the audience at the time as well.
Oh yeah. No. I think, and you've hit upon just 2 great passages, and I think you're hearing it exactly right. And in performance, again, these things, they really become clear, and they really have this pop to them, right? Is that you find yourself wanting to hiss every time Lucifer utters his lines, because he is so full of himself, and he's so kind of oily and slimy at various times. And that one, now there's a lot of music in these plays. There would have been a lot of singing, right? And you're going to have the angels singing the Gloria at that moment, right? And it's, again, you've had these kind of earthy, hilarious, goofball shepherds kind of bumbling their way through life. And then this astonishing music starts. Yeah, and then their reaction is this kind of doggerel of like, hey, wasn't that good stuff? I like that music, I thought that was fun.
But the verse form is almost inherently comical sounding in this play too, because it's this kind of triplet thing, which often sounds kind of comical and, doggerel like to us for some reason in English, but then this internal rhyme. There's something just funny. I wish I could find another. This is one of the shepherds describing, I think his wife. Yeah. There's this 2 rhymes per line, which also somehow adds to the comic effect in a way that I can't describe. For as ever I read epistle, I have one to my fair, as sharp as a thistle, as rough as a briar. She is browed like a bristle with the sour loten cheer. Had she once wet her whistle, she could sing full clear, her paternoster. She is great as a whale, she has a gallon of gall.
And the anachronism of the paternoster that has not been taught to anyone yet.
Yes. The form is also kind of complex because it starts with those 4 lines with the 2 rhymes per line, and then it changes to, there's like almost like a bob, like as in the bob and wheel in the Gawain poem at the end of that, and then there's like 4 short lines that. So it's interesting. There's some sort of unusual, complex forms.
Or how about Mac's wife? Right, as they're trying to get them out of the house, right? And Max says, hear ye not how she groans? And, come on, my poor wife, she just gave birth here. And she says, my middle, I pray to God so mild, if ever I you beguiled, that I eat this child that lies in this cradle. Wow, the fun of the quick sing-songy rhymes as she's saying them, but notice she just talked about, right, eating the lamb. There's the cleverness and the quickness. That's in a sense, I don't want to say hiding, right? Because it's not. It's throwing it right out there for you. But are you quick enough to catch along with that? that Eucharistic reference, as
Right.
she's trying to lie to you that, oh, my poor stomach, right? It's so fantastic, and it's so much fun that we see that.
Right. This is I think this is from the end of the resurrection play. Yes. And this is Pilate instructing the soldiers to lie about what the soldiers who had been guarding the tomb at the time of the resurrection. He's telling them to spread lies among the people. And this is a great line. This is a more serious line that feels like it could come out of Shakespeare, perhaps. So Pilate says at the very end of the resurrection play, "Thus shall the sooth be bought and sold, and treason shall for truth be told." Sooth means truth. I'll read that again.
Mhm.
Thus shall the sooth be bought and sold, and treason shall for truth be told. That's a great little couplet there. That really could fit in with a piece of Elizabethan drama or something. It's a great, memorable kind of line. It's a very quotable line. You could use that as an aphorism or something.
And of course, right, it's conveying, right, the ancient notion, right, that Christ never rose from the dead. They just stole his body, right, and so it gets all the way back to that sort of ancient that was told from the very beginning. But yeah, it's just and again in performance that kind of sing-songiness actually works, and there's this really power to it. I really wish we would do these plays. I've had a fantasy that like a place like the University of Dallas would be a wonderful place if we would maybe have each department take one of these plays. Like if departments are kind of the guilds of the modern university, I have this kind of fantasy that this is the kind of place where we could put on these plays. Each department take a different pageant and create a festival of this every year. And I think we'd have the audience that would have fun with this play. And UD students have a kind of playfulness or a whimsicality amidst their seriousness about these, the subjects that they're studying. And, we call it the Catholic University for Independent Thinkers for a reason, because our students have a kind of, a kind of cranky fun while they take themselves, I say they don't take themselves seriously, but they take their work seriously. I'm not trying to create an ad for the university here. I'm just saying my fantasy is that it would be so much fun in modern American Catholic life to really bring these plays back to life for all these reasons that we're talking about. To convey the truths of the faith in this kind of direct way and challenge people, in a comic and yet serious way, which I think is a key to bringing people to the faith, is to show that overarching the Christian vision is a comic vision, right? I say to my students, Christianity can't be a tragedy. It's a comedy in that it's been guaranteed to end well. The only thing we can do is sin and ruin it. But that there's this fundamentally comic vision to Christianity that goes all the way down, and that if we can show, right, humble shepherds, humble carpenters, encountering, right, this Eucharistic vision of the truth in these fun, adventurous, and as you note, really artful ways,
Right.
it really has a powerful effect, I think.
Yeah, there is something powerful too about the idea of doing this whole cycle, which is, of course, is a very liturgical kind of thing. I mean, once you get to the end of this collection that I read, it's just a selection, it doesn't have by any means all of the plays in any one cycle in it. But when you get to the Last Judgment and you have God giving this big monologue at the beginning, sort of looking back on his whole plan for salvation history and how everything happened and is completed just as he, foreordained it. There's a certain like majestic power to that monologue where it's sort of, especially once you've read or, as they would have seen all of these previous plays and have this sort of summing up and this conclusion that happens in the Last Judgment is really great.
It's really moving. It really is moving in performance.
Great. Well, yeah, I hope I get to see one of these performed at some point. All right. Well, Greg, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for suggesting that we do this. I enjoyed getting to know this material.
It's my pleasure. And as I say, I wish more people knew it, and I wish more people could have an experience of it, because it is so powerful and so delightful and so moving by the time you go through the experience. I love my friend Stefan Nowitzki's line. It's theology in 4 dimensions. And to be able to experience theology in 4 dimensions, I think is such a rich gift that we can have. And I just enjoy sharing it with others.
Great. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to find more resources from Catholic Culture, the site that makes this podcast, go to catholicculture.org/newsletter. There you'll be able to sign up for one or more of our email newsletters. You can get sort of general updates as to what's happening on the site. You can also get specific things, like you can opt in for specifically our liturgical year information each day, or our weekly news, things like that. Go to catholicculture.org/newsletter and consider checking one of those out. All right, see you next time.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of catholicculture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at catholicculture.org.